headland corner of Earl Vickery's east neighbor's field had been collecting drainage from the north tile line for 3 weeks, which anyone who had farmed that county for more than 5 years would have known, and which Brent Holloway, who had been running custom harvest in Poweshiek County for 11 years, had either forgotten or not been told. He found out at 7:47 on the morning of October 3rd. The combine, a contemporary John Deere with a 240 horsepower engine and a header wide enough to cut 16 rows in a single pass, a machine worth $280,000 new and worth considerably less than that in the soft headland corner of a field that had been draining to that point for 3 weeks, went in at the front corner first. The header dropped. The forward momentum carried the machine another 8 feet before Brent killed the drive. By then the belly pan was 4 inches from the clay surface, and the rear tires had cut through the saturated top layer and found the dense cold subsoil 18 inches below, where they stopped and declined to go further. Brent sat in the cab for a moment. Then he got on the radio to his crew. The corn was at 18% moisture. It had been at 18% for 4 days, which was the bottom of the optimal harvest window, the moisture level at which the grain required no drying, and the price paid at the elevator was full. The weather forecast showed clear conditions through October 7th and rain beginning the 8th. 5 days, 180 acres. It should have been comfortable. It was no longer comfortable. The combine was buried on the first pass of the first morning of the season, and the October sky above was the specific gray of a sky that is keeping a promise. The crew tried. Brent's service tractor, a 4-wheel drive machine with more than enough horsepower on paper to recover the combine from a soft headland, drove onto the clay from the east access and began its own negotiation with the bearing capacity of 3 weeks of tile drainage. It got within 40 feet of the combine before its own rear wheels cut through the surface layer. Brent had it stopped before it went in fully, but it was no longer free to maneuver, and the situation on the headland had gone from one stuck machine to one stuck machine, with a second machine that was too committed to the soft ground to be useful. Brent called a recovery service in Newton. The dispatcher was sorry. They had 2 trucks out on harvest calls, and the earliest available unit was tomorrow morning. He stood at the field edge and looked at his combine. The corn stood all around it, ripe, at 18%, patient in the specific way of grain that has no opinion about what happens to it but will change anyway when the rain comes. That was when he heard the tractor. Pop, pop, pop. If you've ever watched expensive equipment prove that experience is worth more than horsepower, subscribe to this channel. A new story like this one every week, and none of them end the way the experts expected. Let me tell you about Earl Vickery, because the way he arrived at that fence line tells you something important about how he had spent the previous 40 years. Earl was 73 years old, and he had farmed 180 acres in Poweshiek County since 1961, when he had bought the property from a retiring neighbor at a price that required him to borrow carefully and spend carefully for the following decade. He had made that work by understanding, early and completely, that the most expensive thing on a farm is not the equipment that breaks down once. It is the equipment that cannot be fixed without a telephone call. He had bought the 1949 John Deere Model A in 1962 from an estate sale in Grinnell. He had paid $280, which was not nothing in 1962, and he had spent 2 weekends that autumn going through the engine and the carburetor and the ignition system with the tools in his machine shed. He had not called anyone. In 40 years of farming with the Model A, he had called no one. This was not a record he kept or advertised. It was a consequence of the machine's design and his understanding of it. The horizontal 2-cylinder engine had 12 moving parts in its valve train, compared to 38 in the 4-cylinder diesel that his neighbor had bought in 1968 and replaced in 1974. The carburetor adjusted with 2 fingers and a flat screwdriver. The magneto timing could be set with a wire and a straight edge. Every component on the Model A was accessible with the tools on the shelf above Earl's workbench, and every problem the tractor had ever developed had been diagnosable by Earl, without reference to a manual and repairable in the machine shed, without waiting for parts that had to come from Des Moines. The Model A had also been his soft ground machine for the same 40 years. To understand why, you need to understand what Earl had learned about ground pressure from 40 years of farming the bottomland ground along Walnut Creek, which ran through the south end of his property, and which, in wet springs and wet autumns, made the soil in its vicinity behave in specific ways that punished heavy equipment and rewarded light, wide-tired tractors. Ground pressure is weight divided by contact area. Earl did not know this formula in its algebraic form. He knew it in the empirical form, in the form of watching what happened to machines that didn't respect it. The Model A weighed 3,100 pounds. Its rear tires of wide-profile agricultural tread, the widest available for the A when Earl had fitted them in 1963, produced a contact patch of approximately 250 square inches. Ground pressure, approximately 12 pounds per square inch. The combine that Brent Holloway had driven into the headland corner weighed 32,000 pounds. Its rear tires, substantial as they were, produced a contact pressure of approximately 68 pounds per square inch. The saturated headland clay could support 12 pounds per square inch. It could not support 68. Earl had known this since the morning he watched the combine go in. He had pressed his hand into his own headland soil at the fence line while the combine was still sinking, and had felt the moisture content, and compared it to what he could see across the fence, and had known immediately what had happened and what needed to happen to fix it. He had gone to the machine shed and started the Model A. He arrived at the fence gate at 8:45. Brent Holloway had been standing at the edge of the soft headland for an hour, watching the situation decline from bad to worse, when he heard the sound from Earl's side of the fence. Plop, plop, plop. He turned and saw the Model A coming across Earl's field at walking pace. Single center front wheel navigating the stubble row. Wide rear tires pressing the firm ground. Thin exhaust from the vertical stack rising in the gray October air. An old man in bib overalls and a plaid flannel shirt on the open steel seat, a heavy chain coiled on the drawbar. Two of Brent's crew members started laughing before the Model A had stopped moving. One of them, a young man named Marcus who had been running combine operations for 4 years, and who knew his equipment the way young men know things they have never seen fail, said something that produced more laughter from the group. Earl brought the Model A to the gate and set the brake. He climbed down. He walked to the edge of the headland and stood there for a moment, looking at the combine's angle of entry, the depth on each side, the position of the machine relative to the firmer ground 20 feet to the east. He took off his work glove and pressed his bare hand flat into the headland clay. He stood up. He walked back to the tractor. Brent came over. His crew was still smiling. "That tractor's not going to move my combine," Brent said. Not cruelly, practically. He was a practical man, and the arithmetic seemed clear. 3,100 pounds against 32,000 pounds of stuck machine. Earl looked at him. "Weight's got nothing to do with it," he said. He took the chain off the drawbar. "Show me where it went in," Earl said. Brent showed him. Earl walked around the combine twice, looking at the clay surface the way he had looked at it for 40 years, reading it the way a man reads something written in a language he learned as a child. He looked at the depth on the left side versus the right. He looked at the angle the machine had entered. He looked at where the firmer headland ground began. He walked to the left rear corner of the combine and hooked the chain to the frame at a point 14 inches lower than the standard recovery hook and 8 inches to the left of where Brent's crew had tried to attach their own cable. The chain ran from this point at a diagonal angle toward the east, not straight back, but at 22 degrees off the straight rear axis. Marcus, still watching, said something to the man beside him. Earl walked back to the Model A. He climbed up. He set the throttle. Pop, pop, pop. The single center front wheel of the 1949 John Deere Model A moved onto the headland clay at the eastern boundary, the boundary between the soft saturated zone and the firm ground beneath which the tile line ran. The wheel pressed into the surface and did not cut through it. 12 pounds per square inch. The clay held. The wide rear tires followed, pressing, not cutting. The weight spread across 250 square inches of rubber contact, the surface compressing slightly and no further, the way it compresses under a walking man. The chain went taut. Brent's arms were still crossed. Marcus had stopped talking. The Model G's horizontal engine ran at low RPM, the flywheel storing each combustion stroke and releasing it in the even, continuous pressure that produced not a peak of pulling force, but a sustained, unhurried application of it. The kind of force that does not ask the chain to jerk or the tires to spike past static friction. The kind that simply arrives, continuously, and waits for the ground to cooperate. Pop, pop, pop. For 4 minutes, the combine did not move. Then the left rear corner moved. Not by much, 2 centimeters perhaps, but the clay on the left side of the buried wheel had reached the limit of its grip under sustained load and had let go, and the combine began, in the slow and inevitable way of things obeying geometry, to rotate. The rear axle swung toward the east. The right side, which was shallower, lifted slightly. The left side, now rotating rather than being dragged, began to follow. Pop, pop, pop. The engine note did not change. At 8 minutes, the left rear wheel was half free. At 16 minutes, both rear wheels were clear of the deep burial and moving on the clay surface that had held the Model A without complaint. At 23 minutes, the combine's header lifted. At 31 minutes, Brent Holloway's $280,000 combine was on firm ground, engine running, ready to harvest. Earl set his brake and climbed down and began unhooking the chain. Nobody laughed on the way back. Marcus, who had made the comment when Earl arrived, was looking at the tire tracks in the headland clay, the single narrow groove of the center front wheel beside the wide, shallow impressions of the rear tires, and beside those, the deep churned trenches of the combine's buried rear wheels. He was looking at the difference between 12 pounds per square inch and 68. He was a practical young man, and practical young men understand evidence when it is written in clay in front of them. Brent came over to where Earl was coiling the chain. "I didn't think it would work," Brent said. "I know you didn't," Earl said. "How did you know the angle?" "Left side was 6 inches deeper than the right," Earl said. "You pull against the shallow side, the deep side rotates free. You can't fight a stuck machine straight on. You rotate it." Brent was quiet. Then he took out his phone and walked back to the headland and photographed the tire tracks, Earl's clean shallow impressions beside the combine's churned trenches. He stood there looking at the photographs for a moment. "That's the weight thing," Brent said. "You're lighter." "It's not weight," Earl said. "It's weight divided by how much tire you're running." He explained it the way he explained most things. Once, briefly, without repetition. Weight divided by contact area. The bearing capacity of saturated Iowa headland clay in early October. The reason he had fitted the widest available rear tires to the Model A in 1963 and had not changed his mind in 40 years. Brent saved the tire track photographs in a folder on his phone he labeled Iowa Extraction. He used the technique 11 times over the following 9 harvest seasons, always in soft headland conditions, always with a light tractor and a diagonal chain. It worked every time. He taught it to every operator he hired after that point, without always knowing how to explain why it worked. only that it did, and that an old man in bib overalls had shown it to him on a gray October morning in Poweshiek County, when his $280,000 machine was sitting in the mud, and the rain was coming on the 8th. Harvest began at 9 o'clock that morning. Earl drove the Model A back to his machine shed at 9:15, shut it down, and went to the farmhouse for the second cup of coffee he had been planning since 7 o'clock. The corn came off Brent's field in 2 days. The last load left the field at sundown on October 5th. The rain started on the morning of the 8th, as forecast. It fell on harvested stubble. Earl Vickery farmed his 180 acres in Poweshiek County until 2001, when his son Carl took over the operation at the age of 44, and Earl moved into the farmhouse's south bedroom and watched Carl farm the same ground from the same kitchen window that Earl had watched it from for 40 years. Carl kept the Model A in the machine shed. He uses it for the same jobs Earl used it for: the soft ground work, the wet spring field edges, the October headlands after a wet September. He has fitted it with the same wide rear tire profile Earl fitted in 1963, for the same reason Earl gave him when Carl asked: weight divided by contact area. The Model A has not required a dealer service call in the 42 years, since Earl bought it at the Grinnell estate sale. This is not luck. It is the consequence of a machine with 12 moving parts in its valve train, and a carburetor that adjusts with 2 fingers and a flat screwdriver, and no electrical system to fail in wet conditions, and no hydraulic tolerances to chase when the weather turns. It pops along. Pop, pop, pop. 2 cylinders, 12 pounds per square inch, 31 minutes. The corn came off before the rain. That is what happens when a man understands the ground he is standing on, and the machine under him, and the relationship between those two things, which is not a relationship that changes with the model year. The combine was $280,000 and could not move in soft ground. The Model A was $280 in 1962 and could. Not because it was more powerful. Because the man running it had been reading headland clay since before Brent Holloway's crew chief was born. Pop, pop, pop. 2 cylinders, low and slow. The field was empty before the rain. Some things don't need updating. They just need a man who still knows how to use them.